by Clive Barker. So intent was Frank upon solving the puzzle of the Martian's box that he didn't hear the great bell begin to ring. The device had been constructed by a master craftsman, and the riddle was this, that though he'd been told the box contained wonders, there simply seemed to be no way into it, no clue on any of its 6 black lacquered faces as to the three-dimensional jigsaw from another. Frank had seen similar puzzles, mostly in Hong Kong, products of the Chinese taste for making metaphysics of hard wood, but to the acuity and technical genius of the Chinese, the Frenchman had brought a perverse logic that was entirely his own. If there was a system to the puzzle, Frank had failed to find it. Only after several hours of trial and error did a chance juxtaposition of thumbs, middle and last fingers bear fruit, an almost imperceptible click, and then victory. A segment of the box slid out from beside its neighbours. There were 2 revelations. The first, that the interior skated across the lacquer. The second, that Le Marchand, who had been in his time a maker of singing birds, had constructed the box so that opening a tripped and musical mechanism, which began to tinkle a short rondo of sublime banality. Encouraged by his success, Frank proceeded to work on the box feverishly, quickly finding fresh alignments of fluted slot and peg, which in their turn revealed further intricacies. And with each solution, each new half, twist, pull, a further melodic element was brought into play. The tune, counterpointed and developed until the initial caprice was all but lost in ornamentation. At some point in his labours, the bell had begun to ring a steady, sombre tolling. He had not heard. As the box unknotted, he became aware that his stomach churned so violently at the sound of the bell, it might have been ringing half a lifetime. And he looked up from his work. For a few moments he supposed the noise to be coming from somewhere in the street outside, but he rapidly dismissed that notion. It had been almost midnight before he'd begun to work on the bird-maker's box. Several hours had gone by, hours he would not have remembered passing, but for the evidence of his watch since then. There was no church in the city, however desperate for adherents, that would ring the summoning bell at such an hour. No, the sound was coming from somewhere much more distant, through the very door, as yet invisible, that Le Marchand miraculous box had been constructed to open. Everything Kirschen, who had sold him the box, had promised of it was true. He was on the threshold of a new world, a province infinitely far from the room in which he sat. Infinitely far, yet now suddenly near. The thought had made his breath quick. He had anticipated this moment so keenly, planned with every wit he possessed this rending of the veil. In moments they would be here, the ones Kircher had called the Cenobites, theologians of the Order of the Gash, summoned from their experiments in the higher reaches of pleasure to bring their ageless heads into a world of rain and failure. He had worked ceaselessly in the preceding week to prepare the room for them. The bare boards had been meticulously scrubbed and strewn with petals. Upon the west wall he had set up a kind of altar to them, decorated with the kind of placatory offerings Kirsche had assured him would nurture their good offices: bones, bonbons, needles. A jug of his urine, the product of 7 days' collection, stood on the left of the altar. Should they require some spontaneous gesture of self-defilement? On the right, a plate of doves' heads, which Kirsche had also advised them to have on hand. He had left no part of the invocation ritual unobserved. No cardinal, eager for the fisherman's shoes, could have been more diligent. But now, as the sound of the bell became louder, drowning out the music box, he was afraid. Too late, he murmured to himself, hoping to quell his rising fear. Le Marchand's device was undone. The final trick had been turned. There was no time left for prevarication or regret. Besides, hadn't he risked both life and sanity to make this unveiling possible? The doorway was even now opening to pleasures no more than a handful of humans had ever known existed, much less tasted. Pleasures which would redefine the parameters of sensation, which would release him from the dull ground of desire, seduction, and disappointment that had dogged him from late adolescence. He would be transformed by that knowledge, wouldn't he? No man could experience the profundity of such feeling and remain unchanged. The bare bulb in the middle of the room dimmed and brightened and dimmed again. It had taken on the rhythm of the bell, burning its hottest on each chime. In the troughs between the chimes, the darkness in the room became utter. It was as if the world he had occupied for 29 years had ceased to exist. Then the bell would sound again, and the bulb burned so strongly it might never have faltered. For a few precious seconds, he was standing in a familiar place with a door that led out and down and into the street, and a window through which, had he but the will or strength to tear the blinds back, he might glimpse a rumour of morning. With each peal the bulb's light was becoming more revelatory. By it, he saw the east wall flayed, saw the brick momentarily lose solidity and blow away, saw in that same instant the place beyond the room from which the bell's din was issuing. A world of birds, was it? Vast black birds caught in perpetual tempest. That was all the sense he could make of the province from which even now the hierophants were coming. It was in confusion, and full of brittle, broken things that rose and fell and filled the dark air with their fright. And then the wall was solid again. The bell fell silent. The bulb flickered out. This time it went without a hope of rekindling. He stood in the darkness and said nothing. Even if he could remember the words of welcome he prepared, his tongue would not have spoken them. It was playing dead in his mouth, and And then, light. It came from them, from the quartet of Cenobites who now, with the walls sealed behind them, occupied the room. A fitful phosphorescence, like the glow of deep-sea fishes, blue, cold, charmless. It struck Frank, and he had never once wondered what they would look like. His imagination, though fertile when it came to trickery and theft, was impoverished in other regards. The skill to picture these eminences was beyond him, so he had not even tried. Why, then, was he so distressed to set eyes upon them? Was it the scars that covered every inch of their body? The flesh, cosmetically punctured and sliced and infibulated, then dusted down with ash? Was it the smell of vanilla they brought them, the sweetness of which did little to disguise the stench beneath. Or was it that as the light grew, and he scanned them more closely, he saw nothing of joy, or even humanity in their maimed faces, only desperation, and an appetite that made his bowels ache to be voided. "What city is this?" one of the four inquired. Frank had difficulty guessing the speaker's gender with any certainty. Its clothes, some of which were sewn to and through its skin, in its private parts, and there was nothing in the dregs of its voice or in its wilfully disfigured features that offered the least clue. When it spoke, the hooks that transfixed the flaps of its eyes and were wed by an intricate system of chains passed through the flesh and bone alike. Dissimilar hooks through the lower lip were teased by the motion exposing the glistening meat beneath. "I asked you a question," it said. Frank made no reply. The name of the city was the last thing on his mind. "Do you understand?" The figure beside the first speaker demanded. Its voice, unlike that of its companion, was light and breathy, the voice of an excited girl. Every inch of its head had been tattooed with an intricate grid, and at every intersection of horizontal and vertical axes a jeweled pin driven through to the bone. Its tongue was similarly decorated. "Do you even know who we are?" it asked. "Yes," Frank said at last. "I know." Of course he knew. He and Kirsche had spent long nights talking of hints gleaned from the diaries of Bolingbroke and Giles de Rais. All that mankind knew of the Order of Gash, he knew. And yet, he had expected something different. He expected some sign of the numberless splendours they had access to. He had thought they would come with women, at least oiled women, milked women, women shaved and muscled for the act of love, their lips perfumed, their thighs trembling to spread, their buttocks weighty, the way he liked them. He had expected sighs and languid bodies spread on the floor underfoot like a living carpet, had expected virgin whores whose every crevice was his for the asking, and whose skills would press him upward, to undreamed of ecstasies. The world would be forgotten in their arms. He would be exalted by his lust, instead despised for it. But no women, no sighs, only these sexless things with their corrugated flesh. Now the third spoke. Its features were so heavily scarified, the wounds nurtured until they ballooned, that its eyes were invisible, and its words corrupted by the disfigurement of its mouth. "What do you want?" it asked him. He perused this questioner more confidently than he had the other two. His fear was draining away with every second that passed. Memories of the terrifying place beyond the wall were already receding. He was left with these decrepit decadents, with their stench, their queer deformity, their self-evident frailty. The only thing he had to fear was nausea. "Kirsche told me there would be 5 of you," Frank said. "The engineer would arrive should the moment merit," came the reply. "Now again, we ask you, what do you want?" Why should he not answer them straight? "Pleasure," he replied. "Kirsche said you know about pleasure." "Oh, we do," said the first of them. "Everything you ever wanted." "Yes, of course." He stared at him with his all too naked eyes. "What have you dreamed?" it said. The question, but so boldly, confounded him. How could he hope to articulate the nature of the phantasms his libido had created? He was still searching for words when one of them said, "This world, it disappoints you." "Pretty much," he replied. You're not the first to tire of its trivialities, came the response. There have been others. Not many. Not many, the gridded face put in. True. A handful at best, but a few have dared to use Le Martian's configuration. Men, like yourself, hungry for new possibilities, who've heard that we have skills unknown in your region. I'd expected, Frank began. We know what you expected, the Cenobite replied. We understand to its breadth and depth the nature of your frenzy. It is utterly familiar to us, Frank grunted. So, he said, you know what I've dreamed about. You can supply the pleasure. The thing's face broke open, its lips curling back a baboon smile. Not as you understand it, came the reply. Frank made to interrupt, but the creature raised a silencing hand. There are conditions of the nerve endings, it said, the like of which your imagination, however fevered, could not hope to evoke. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, most certainly. Your most treasured depravity is child's play beside the experiences we offer. Will you partake of them? Said the second Cenobite. Frank looked at the scars and the hooks. Again his tongue was deficient. Will you? Outside, somewhere near, the world would soon be waking. He had watched it wake from the window of this very room, day after day, stirring itself to another round of fruitless pursuits. And he'd known that there was nothing left out there to excite him. No heat, only sweat. No passion, only sudden lust, and just as sudden indifference. He had turned his back on such dissatisfaction. If in doing so he had to interpret the signs these creatures brought him, then that was the price of ambition. He was ready to pay it. Show me, he said. There's no going back. You do understand that. Show me. They needed no further invitation to raise the curtain. He heard the door creak as it was opened and turned to see that the world beyond the threshold had disappeared, to be replaced by the same panic-filled darkness from which the members of the Order had stepped. He looked back towards the Cenobites, seeking some explanation for this, but they disappeared. Their passing had not gone unrecorded, however. They'd taken the flowers with them, leaving only bare boards, and on the wall the offerings he had assembled were blackening, as if in the heat of some fierce but invisible flame. He smelled the bitterness of their consumption. It pricked his nostrils so acutely he was certain they would bleed. But the smell of burning was only the beginning. No sooner had he registered it than half a dozen other scents filled his head. Perfumes he had scarcely noticed until now were suddenly overpoweringly strong. The lingering scent of filched blossoms, the smell of the paint on the darkness outside the door, and in it the ordure of the 100,000 birds. He put his hand to his mouth and nose to stop the onslaught from overcoming him, but the stench of perspiration on his fingers made him giddy. He might have been driven to nausea had there not been fresh sensations flooding his system from each nerve ending and taste bud. It seemed he could suddenly feel the collision of the dust motes with his skin. Every drawn breath chafed his lips. Every blink, his eyes, bile burned in the back of his throat, and a morsel of yesterday's beef that had lodged between his teeth sent spasmed through his system as it exuded a droplet of gravy upon his tongue. His ears were no less sensitive. His head was filled with 1,000 dins, some of which he himself was father to. The air that broke against his eardrums was a hurricane. The flatulence in his bowels was thunder. But there were other sounds, innumerable sounds, which assailed him from somewhere beyond himself. Voices raised in anger, whispered professions of love, roars, rattling, snatches of song, tears. Was it the world he was hearing? Mourning, breaking in 1,000 homes. He had no chance to listen closely. The cacophony drove any power of analysis from his head. But there was worse. The eyes. Oh, God in heaven, he had never guessed that they could be such torment. He, who'd thought there was nothing on earth left to startle him, now he reeled. Everywhere, sight. The plain plastered the ceiling was an awesome geography of brushstrokes. The weave of his plain shirt, an unbearable elaboration of threads. In the corner, he saw a mite move on a dead dove's head and wink its eyes at him, seeing that he saw too much. Appalled, he shut his eyes. But there was more inside than out. Memories whose violence shook him to the verge of senselessness. He sucked his mother's milk, choked, felt his siblings' arms around him. A fight, was it, or a brotherly embrace? Either way, it suffocated. And more, so much more. A short lifetime of sensations, all writ in a perfect hand upon his cortex, breaking him with their insistence that they should be remembered. He felt close to exploding. Surely, the world outside his head, the room and the birds beyond the door, they, for all their shrieking excesses, could not be as overwhelming as his memories. Better that, he thought, and tried to open his eyes. They wouldn't unglue. Tears or pus or needle and thread had sealed them up. He thought of the faces of the Cenobites, the hooks, the chains. They worked some similar surgery on him, locking them up behind his eyes on the parade of his history. In fear of his sanity, he began to address them. He was no longer certain that they were even within earshot. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing this to me?" The echo of his words roared in his ears, but he scarcely attended to it. More sense impressions were swimming up from the past that tormented him. Childhood still lingered in his tongue, milk and frustration, but there were adult feelings joining it now. He was grown, he was mustached and mighty, hands heavy, gut large. Youthful pleasures had possessed the appeal of newness, but as the years had crept on, mild sensation lost its potency. Stronger and stronger experiences had been called for, and here they came again, more pungent for being laid in darkness at the back of his head. He felt untold tastes upon his tongue, bitter, sweet, sour, salty, smelled spice and shit and his mother's hair. Saw cities and skies, saw speed, saw deeps, broke bread with men now dead, and was scalded by the heat of their spittle on his cheek. And of course there were women. Always amid the flurry of confusion, memories of women appeared, assaulted him with their scents, their textures, their tastes. The proximity of this harem aroused him, despite circumstances. He opened his trousers and caressed his cock, more eager to have the seed spilled and so be freed of these creatures than for the pleasures of it. He was dimly aware, as he worked his inches, that he must make a pitiful sight, a blind man in an empty room aroused for a dream's sake. But the racking, joyless orgasm failed to even slow the relentless display. His knees buckled and his body collapsed to the boards where his spike had fallen. There was a spasm of pain as he hit the floor, but the response was washed away before another wave of memories. He rolled onto his back and screamed and begged for an end to it, but the sensations only rose higher still, whipped to fresh heights with every prayer of cessation he offered up. The pleas became single sound, words and scents eclipsed by panic. It seemed there was no end to this, but madness, no hope, but to be lost to hope. As he formulated his last despairing thought, the torment stopped. All at once, all of it, gone. Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. He was abruptly bereft of them all. There were seconds then, when he doubted his very existence. 2 heartbeats, 3, 4. On the 5th beat, he opened his eyes. The room was empty. The doves and the piss pot gone. The door was closed. Gingerly, he sat up. His limbs were tingling, his head, wrist and bladder ached. And then a movement at the other end of the room drew his attention. where 2 moments before there had been an empty space, there was now a figure. It was the fourth Cenobite. The one that had never spoken or shown its face. Not a he now saw, but she. The hood it had worn had been discarded, as had the robes. The woman beneath was grey yet gleaming, her lips bloody, her legs parted so that the elaborate scarification of her pubis was displayed. She sat on a pile of rotting human heads and smiled in welcome. The collision of sensuality and death appalled him. Could he have any doubt that she had personally dispatched these victims? Their rot was beneath her nails, and their tongues, 20 more, laid out in ranks on her oiled thighs, as if awaiting entrance. Nor did he doubt that the brains now seeping from their ears and nostrils had been driven to insanity before a blow or a kiss had stopped their hearts. Kirscher had lied to him. Either that or he'd been horribly deceived. There was no pleasure in the air, or at least not as humankind understood it. He had made a mistake opening Le Martian's box. A very terrible mistake. Oh, so you finished dreaming, said the Cenobite, perusing him as he lay panting on the bare boards. Good. She stood up. The tongues fell to the floor like a rain of slugs. Now we can begin. It's not quite what I expected, Julia commented as they stood in the hallway. It was twilight. A cold day in August. Not the ideal time to view a house that had been left empty for so long. It needs work, Rory said. That's all. It's not been touched since my grandmother died. That's the best part of 3 years. And I'm pretty sure she never did anything to it towards the end of her life. And it's yours? Mine and Frank's. It was willed to us both, but when was the last time anybody saw Big Brother? She shrugged, as if she couldn't remember, though she remembered very well. A week before the wedding. Someone said he spent a few days here last summer, ratting away, no doubt. Then he was off again. He's got no interest in property. But suppose we move in and then he comes back, wants what's his. I'll buy him out. I'll get a loan from the bank and I'll buy him out. He's always hard up for cash. She nodded, but looked less than persuaded. Don't worry, he said, going to where she was standing and wrapping his arms around her. The place is ours, dog. We can paint it and pamper it and make it like heaven. He scanned her face. Sometimes, particularly when doubt moved her, as it did now, her beauty came close to frightening him. Trust me, he said. I do. All right then. What say we start moving in on Sunday? Sunday. It was still the Lord's day up this end of the city. Even if the owners of these well-dressed houses and well-pressed children were no longer believers, they still observed the Sabbath. A few curtains were twitched aside when Luton's van drew up, and the unloading began. Some curious neighbours even sauntered past the house once or twice on the pretext of walking the hounds, but nobody spoke to the new arrivals, much less offered a hand with the furniture. Sunday was not a day to break sweat. Julia looked after the unpacking, while Rory organised the unloading of the van, with Luton and Mad Bob providing the extra muscle. It took 4 round trips to transfer the bulk of the stuff from Alexandra Road, and at the end of the day there was still a good deal of bric-a-brac left behind, to be collected at a later point. About 2 in the afternoon, Kirsty turned up on the doorstep. Came to see if I could give you a hand, she said, with a tone of vague apology in her voice. Well, you'd better come in, Julia said. She went back into the front room, which was a battlefield in which only chaos was winning, and quietly cursed Rory. Inviting the lost soul round to offer her services was his doing, no doubt of it. She would be more of a hindrance than a help. Her dreamy, perpetually defeated manner set Julia's teeth on edge. "What can I do?" Kirsty asked. Rory said, "Yes," said Julia. "I'm sure he did. Where is he? Rory, I mean. Gone back for another van load, to add to the misery." "Oh." Julia softened her expression. "You know, it's very sweet of you to come round like this, but I don't think there's much you can do just at the moment." Kirsty flushed slightly. Dreamy she was, but not stupid. "See," she said. "You sure? Maybe I could make a cup of coffee for you." "Coffee?" said Julia. The thought of it made her realise just how parched her throat had become. "Yes," she conceded. "That's not a bad idea." The coffee-making was not without its minor traumas. No task Kirsty undertook was ever entirely simple. She stood in the kitchen boiling water in a pan it had taken a quarter of an hour to find, thinking that maybe she shouldn't have come after all. Julia always looked at her so strangely, as if faintly baffled by the fact that she hadn't been smothered and burned. No matter. Rory had asked her to come, hadn't he? And that was invitation enough. She would not have turned down the chance of his smile for 100 Julias. The van arrived 25 minutes later, minutes in which the women had twice attempted and twice failed to get a conversation simmering. They had little in common. Julia, the sweet, the beautiful, the winner of glances and kisses, and Kirsty, the girl with the pale handshake whose eyes were only ever as bright as Julia's before or after tears. She had long ago decided that life was unfair. But why? When she'd accepted the bitter truth, did circumstance insist on rubbing her face in it? She surreptitiously watched Julia as she worked, and it seemed to Kirsty that the woman was incapable of ugliness. Every gesture, a stray hair brushed from the eyes with the back of the hand, dust blown down from a favourite cup, were infused with such effortless grace. Seeing it, she understood Rory's dog-like adulation, and understanding it, despaired afresh. He came in at last, squinting and sweaty. The afternoon sun was fierce. He grinned at her, parading the ragged line of his front teeth that she had first found so irresistible. "I'm glad you could come," he said. "Happy to help," she replied. But he had already looked away at Julia. "How's it going?" "I'm losing my mind," she told him. "Well, now you can rest from your labours," he said. "We brought the bed this trip." He gave her a conspiratorial wink, but she didn't respond. "Can I help with unloading?" Kirsty offered. "Luton and MB are doing it," came Rory's reply. "Oh, but I'd give an arm and a leg for a cup of tea." "We haven't found a tea," Julia told her. "Oh, maybe a coffee then." "Right," said Kirsty. "And for the other two?" "They'd kill for a cup." Kirsty went back to the kitchen, filled the small pan to near brimming, and set it back on the stove. From the hallway, she heard Rory supervising the next unloading. It was the bed, the bridal bed, but she tried very hard to keep the thought of his embracing Julia out of her mind. She could not. As she stared into the water, and it simmered and steamed and finally boiled, the same painful images of their pleasure came back and back. While the trio were away, gathering the fourth and final load of the day, Julia lost her temper with the unpacking. It was a disaster, she said. Everything had been parcelled up and put into the tea chest in the wrong order. She was having to disinter perfectly useful items to get access to the bare necessities. Kirsty kept her silence in her place in the kitchen, washing the soiled cups. Cursing louder, Julia left the chaos and went out for a cigarette on the front step. She leaned against the front door and breathed the pollen-gilded air. Already, though it was only the 21st of August, the afternoon was tinged with a smoky scent that heralded autumn. She had lost track of how fast the day had gone. For as she stood there, a bell began to ring for evensong. The run of chimes, rising and falling in lazy waves. The first sound was reassuring. It made her think of her childhood, though not that she could remember of any particular day or place, simply of being young, of mystery. It was 4 years since she last stepped into a church, the day of her marriage to Rory. In fact, the thought of that day, or rather, the promise it had failed to fulfill, soured the moment. She left the step, chimes in full flight, turned back into the house. After the touch of the sun on her upturned face, the interior seemed gloomy. Suddenly, she, tired to the point of tears, they would have to assemble the bed before they could put their heads down to sleep tonight, and they had yet to decide which room they would use as the master bedroom. She would do that now, she elected, and so avoid having to return to the front room and to ever mournful Kirsty. The bell was still pealing when she opened the door of the front room on the second floor. It was the largest of the 3 upper rooms, a natural choice, but the sun had not got in today, or any other day this summer, as the blinds were drawn across the window. The room was consequently chillier than anywhere else in the house, the air stagnant. She crossed the stained floorboards of the window, intending to remove the blind. And at the sill, a strange thing, the blind had been securely nailed to the window frame, effectively cutting out the last intrusion of light from the sunlit street beyond. She tried to pull the material free, but failed. The workman, whoever he'd been, had done a thorough job. No matter. She'd have Rory take a claw hammer to the nails when he got back. She turned from the window, and as she did so, she was suddenly, forcibly aware that the bell was still summoning the faithful. Were they not coming tonight? Was the hook not sufficiently baited with promises of paradise? The thought was only half alive. It withered in moments, but the bell rolled on, reverberating around the room. Her limbs, already aching with fatigue, seemed dragged down further by each peal. Her head throbbed intolerably. The room was hateful, she decided. It was stale, and its benighted walls clammy. Despite its size, she would not let Rory persuade her into its using as the master bedroom. Let it rot. She started towards the door. As she came within a yard of it, the corners of the room seemed to creak, and the door slammed. Her nerves jangled. It was all she could do to prevent herself from sobbing. Instead, she simply said, "Go to hell," and snatched at the handle. It turned easily. Why should it not? Yet she was relieved, and the door swung open. From the hall below, a splash of warmth and ochre light. She closed the door behind her, and with a queer satisfaction, the root of which she couldn't or wouldn't fathom, turned the key in the lock. As she did so, the bell stopped. "But it's the biggest of the rooms. I don't like it, Rory. It's damp. We can use the back room. If we can get the bloody bed through the door." "Of course we can. You know we can." "It seems a waste of a good room," he protested, knowing full well that this was a feint accompli. "Mother knows best," she told him, and smiled at him with eyes whose lustre was far from maternal. The seasons long for each other, like men and women, in order that they may be cured of their excesses. Spring, if it lingers more than a week beyond its span, starts the hunger for summer to end, the days of perpetual promise. Summer, in its turn, soon begins to sweat for something to quench its heat, and the mellowest of autumns will tire of gently at last, and ache for a quick, sharp frost to kill its fruitfulness. Even winter, the hardest season, the most implacable dreams, as February creeps on, of the flame that will presently melt it away. Everything tires of time and starts to seek some opposition to save it from itself. So August gave way to September, and there were few complaints. With work, the house on Ludovico Street began to look more hospitable. There were even visits from neighbours who, after sizing up the couple, spoke freely of how happy they were to have number 55 occupied again. Only one of them made any mention of Frank, referring in passing to the odd fellow who'd lived in the house for a few weeks the previous summer. There was a moment of embarrassment when Rory revealed the tenant to have been his brother, but it was soon glossed over by Julia, whose power to charm knew no bounds. Rory had seldom made mention of Frank during the years of his marriage to Julia, though he and his brother were only 18 months apart in age, and had, as children, been inseparable. This Julia had learned on occasion of drunken reminiscing, a month or two before the wedding, when Rory had spoken at length about Frank. It had been melancholy talk. The brothers' paths had diverged considerably once they passed through adolescence, and Rory regretted it, regretted still more the pain Frank's wild lifestyle had brought to their parents. It seemed that when Frank appeared, once in a blue moon, from whichever corner of the globe he was presently laying waste, he only brought grief. His tales of adventures in the shallows of criminality, his talk of whores and petty theft, all appalled their parents. But there had been worse, or so Rory had said. In his wilder moments, Frank had talked of a life lived in delirium, of an appetite for experience that conceded no moral imperative. Was it the tone of Rory's telling, a mixture of revulsion and envy, that had so piqued Julia's curiosity? Whatever the reason, she had been quickly seized by an unquenchable curiosity concerning this madman. Then, barely a fortnight before the wedding, the black sheep had appeared in the flesh. Things had gone well for him of late. He was wearing gold rings on his fingers, and his skin was tight and tanned. There was little outward sign of the monster Rory had described. Whether Frank was smooth as a polished stone, she had succumbed to his charm within hours. A strange time ensued. As the days crept toward the date of the wedding, she found herself thinking less and less of her husband-to-be, and more of his brother. They were not wholly dissimilar. A certain lilt in their voices, and their easy manner marked them as siblings. But to Rory's qualities, Frank brought something his brother would never have. A beautiful desperation. Perhaps what happened next had been inevitable, and no matter how hard she fought her instincts, she would only have postponed the consummation of their feelings for each other. At least, that was how she tried to excuse herself later. But when all the self-recrimination was done with, she still treasured the memory of their first and last encounter. Kirsty had been at the house, hadn't she? On some matrimonial business when Frank had arrived. And by that telepathy that comes with desire and fades with it, Julia had known that today was the day. She'd left Kirsty to her list-making or such like, and taken Frank upstairs on the pretext of showing him the wedding dress. That was how she remembered it, that he'd asked to see the dress, and she put the veil on, laughing to think of herself in white, and then he'd been at her shoulder, lifting the veil, and she laughed on, laughed and laughed, as though to test the strength of his purpose. He had not been cooled by her mirth, however, nor had he wasted time with the niceties of seduction. The smooth exterior gave way to cruder stuff almost immediately. Their coupling had had in every regard but the matter of her acquiescence, the aggression, and the joylessness of rape. Memories sweetened events, of course, and in the 4 years and 5 months since that afternoon, she'd replayed the scene often. Now, in remembering it, the bruises were trophies of their passion, her tears proof positive of her feelings for him. Mm-hmm. The day following, he disappeared, flitted off to Bangkok or Easter Island, some place where he had no debts to answer. And she'd mourned him, couldn't help it, nor had her mourning gone unnoticed. though it was never explicitly discussed, she had often wondered if the subsequent deterioration of her relationship with Rory had not started there, with her thinking of Frank as she made love to his brother. And now, despite the change of domestic interiors and the chance of a fresh start together, it seemed that events conspired to remind her again of Frank. It wasn't just the gossip of the neighbours that brought him to mind. One day, when she was alone in the house and unpacking various personal belongings, she came across several wallets of Rory's photographs. Many were relatively recent, pictures of the two of them together in Athens and Malta. But buried amongst the transparent smiles were some pictures she couldn't remember ever having seen before. Had Rory kept them from her? Family portraits that went back decades. A photograph of his parents on their wedding day. The black and white image eroded over the years to a series of greys. Pictures of christenings, in which proud godparents cradled babies smothered in family lace. And then, photographs of the brothers together, as toddlers, with wide eyes, as surely school children, stacked at gymnastics displays and in school pageants. Then, with the shyness of acne-ridden adolescence took over, the number of pictures dwindled until the frogs emerged as princes the other side of puberty. Seeing Frank in brilliant colour, clowning for the camera, she felt herself blushing. He had been an exhibitionist youth, predictably enough, always dressed de la mode. Rory, by comparison, looked dowdy. It seemed to her that the brothers' future lives were sketched in these early portraits. Frank, the smiling, seductive chameleon. Rory, the solid citizen. She had packed the pictures away at last, and found, when she stood up, that with the blushes had come tears. Not of regret. She had no use for that. It was fury that made her eyes sting. Somehow, between one breath and the next, she'd lost herself. She knew, too, with perfect certainty, when her grip had first faltered, lying on a bed of wedding lace, while Frank beset her neck with kisses. Once in a while, she went up to the room with the sealed blinds. So far, they'd done little decorating work on the upper floors, preferring to first organise the areas in public gaze. The room had therefore remained untouched, unentered, indeed, except for these few visits of hers. She wasn't sure why she went up, nor how to account for the old assortment of feelings that beset her while there. But there was something about the dark interior that gave her comfort. It was a womb of sorts, a dead woman's womb. Sometimes, when Rory was at work, she simply took herself up the stairs and sat in the stillness, thinking of nothing, or at least nothing she could put words to. These sojourns made her feel oddly guilty, and she tried to stay away from the room when Rory was around. But it wasn't always possible. Sometimes her feet took her there, without instruction to do so. It happened thus that Saturday, the day of the blood. She had been watching Rory at work on the kitchen door, chiselling several layers of paint from around the hinges, when she seemed to hear the room call. Satisfied that he was thoroughly engrossed in his chores, she went upstairs. It was cooler than usual. She was glad of it. She put her hand to the wall and then transferred her chilled palm to her forehead. No use, she murmured to herself, picturing the man at work downstairs. She didn't love him, no more than he, beneath his infatuation with her face, loved her. He chiselled in a world of his own. She suffered here, far removed from him. A gust of wind caught the back door below. She heard it slam. Downstairs, the sound made Rory lose his concentration. The chisel jumped its groove and sliced deeply into the thumb of his left hand. He shouted as a gush of colour came. The chisel hit the floor. Hell and damnation! She heard, but did nothing. Too late. She surfaced through the stupor of melancholy to realise he was coming upstairs. Fumbling for the key and an excuse to justify her presence in the room, she stood up, but he was already at the door, crossing the threshold, rushing toward her. His right hand clamped ineptly around his left. Blood was coming in abundance. It welled up between his fingers and dribbled down his arm, dripping from his elbow, adding stain to stain on the bare boards. "What have you done?" she asked him. "What does it look like?" he said through gritted teeth. "Cut myself." His face and neck had gone the colour of window putty. She'd seen him like this before. He had, on occasion, passed out at the sight of his own blood. "Do something," he said queasily. "Is it deep?" "I don't know," he yelled at her. "I don't want to look." He was ridiculous, she thought, but this wasn't the time to give vent to the contempt she felt. Instead, she took his bloody hand in hers, and while he looked away, prized the palm from the cut. It was sizable, still bleeding profusely. Deep blood. Dark blood. "I think we'd better take you off to the hospital," she told him. "Can you cover it up?" he asked, his voice devoid of anger now. "Sure. I'll get a clean binding. Come on." "No," he said, shaking his ashen face. "If I take a step, I think I'll pass out." "Stay here, then," she soothed him. "You'll be fine." Finding no bandages in the bathroom cabinet, the equal for staunching, she fetched a few clean handkerchiefs from his drawer and went back into the room. He was leaning against the wall now, his skin glossy with sweat. He had padded in the blood he'd shed. She could taste the tang of it in the air. Still quietly reassuring him that he wouldn't die of a 2-inch cut, she wound a handkerchief around his hand, bounded on with a second, and escorted him, trembling like a leaf, down the stairs, one by one, child, and out to the car. At the hospital they waited an hour in a queue of the walking wounded before he was finally seen and stitched up. It was difficult for her to know in retrospect what was more comical about the episode, his weakness or the extravagance of his subsequent gratitude. She told him, when he became fulsome, that she didn't want thanks from him, and it was true. She wanted nothing he could offer her, except, perhaps, his absence. "Did you clean up the floor in the damp room?" she asked him the following day. They called it the damp room since that first Sunday, though there was not a sign of rot from ceiling to skirting board. Rory looked up from his magazine. Grey moons hung beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept well, so he'd said. A cut finger, and he had nightmares of mortality. She, on the other hand, had slept like a babe. "What did you say?" he asked her. "Floor," she said again. "There was blood on the floor. You cleaned it up." He shook his head. "No," he said simply, and turned to the magazine. "Well, I didn't," she said. He offered her an indulgent smile. "You're such a perfect hausfrau," he said. "You don't even know when you're doing it." The subject was closed there. He was content, apparently, to believe that she was quietly losing her sanity. She, on the other hand, the strangest sense that she was about to find it again. Kirsty hated parties. The smiles to be pasted on over the panic, the glances to be interpreted, and worse, the conversation. She had nothing to say of the least interest to the world. Of this she had long been convinced. She'd watched too many eyes glaze over to believe otherwise, seen every device known to man for wheedling oneself out of the company of the dull, from "Will you excuse me, I believe I see my accountant," to passing out dead drunk at her feet. But Rory had insisted she come to the house warming. Just a few close friends, he promised. She said yes, knowing all too well what scenario would ensue from refusal, moping at home in a stew of self-recrimination, cursing her cowardice, and thinking of Rory's sweet face. The gathering wasn't such a torment as it turned out. There were only 9 guests in total, all of whom she knew vaguely, which made it easier. They didn't expect her to illuminate the room, only to nod and laugh where appropriate, and Rory, his hand still bound up, was at his most winning, full of guileless bonhomie. She even wondered if Neville, one of Rory's work colleagues, wasn't making eyes at her behind his spectacles. A suspicion that was confirmed in the middle of the evening, when he manoeuvred himself to her side and inquired whether she had any interest in cat breeding. She told him she hadn't, but was always interested in new experiences. He seemed delighted, and on this fragile pretext proceeded to ply her with liquors for the rest of the night. By 11:30, she was woozy but happy wreck, prompted by the most casual remark to ever more painful fits of giggling. A little after midnight, Julia declared that she was tired and wanted to go to bed. The statement was taken as a general cue for dispersal, but Rory would have none of it. He was up and refilling glasses before anyone had a chance to protest. Kirsty was certain she caught a look of displeasure across Julia's face. Then it passed, and the brow was unsullied once again. She said her good night, was complimented profusely on her skill with calf's liver, and went to bed. The flawlessly beautiful were flawlessly happy, weren't they? To Kirsty, this had always seemed self-evident. Tonight, however, the alcohol made her wonder if envy hadn't blinded her. Perhaps to be flawless was another kind of sadness. But her spinning head had an inept hold on such ruminations, and the next minute Rory was up telling a joke about a gorilla and a Jesuit that had her choking on her drink before he'd even got to the votive candles. Upstairs, Julia heard a fresh bout of laughter. She was indeed tired, as she claimed, but it wasn't the cooking that had exhausted her. It was the effort of suppressing her contempt for the damned fools who were gathered in the lounge below. She called them friends once, these half-wits, with their poor jokes and their poorer pretensions. She had played along with them for several hours. It was enough. Now she needed some cool space, darkness. As soon as she opened the door of the damp room, she knew things were not quite as they had been. The light from the shadeless bulb on the landing illuminated the boards where Rory's blood had fallen, now so clean they might have been scrubbed. Beyond the reach of the light, the room bowed to darkness. She stepped in, closed the door. The lock clicked into place at her back. The dark was almost perfect, and she was glad of it. Her eyes rested against the night, their surfaces chilled. Then, from the far side of the room, she heard a sound. It was no louder than the din of a cockroach running behind the skirting boards, and after seconds, it stopped. She held her breath. It came again. This time there seemed to be some pattern to the sound, a primitive code. They were laughing like loons downstairs. The noise awoke desperation in her. What would she not do to be free of such company? She swallowed and spoke to the darkness. "I hear you," she said, not certain of why the words came out or to whom they were addressed. The cockroach scratches ceased for a moment, and then began again, more urgently. She stepped away from the door and moved towards the noise, and continued, as if summoning her. It was easy to miscalculate with the dark, and she reached the wall before she'd expected to. Raising her hands, she began to run her palms over the painted plaster. The surface was not uniformly cold. There was a place, she judged it to be halfway between the door and window, where the chill became so intense she had to break contact. The cockroach stopped scratching, and there was a moment when she swam, totally disoriented in darkness and silence, and then something moved in front of her. A trick of her mind's eye, she assumed, for there was only imagined light to be had here. But the next spectacle showed her the error of that assumption. The wall was alight, or rather something behind it burned with a cold luminescence that made the solid brick seem insubstantial stuff. More, the wall seemed to be coming apart, segments of it shifting and dislocating like a magician's prop, oiled panels giving on to hidden boxes whose sides in turn collapsed to reveal some further hiding place. She watched fixedly, not daring to even blink for fear she missed some detail of this extraordinary sleight of hand, while pieces of the world came apart in front of her eyes. Then, suddenly, somewhere in this ever more elaborate system of sliding fragments, she saw, or again, seemed to see, movement. Only now did she realise that she'd been holding her breath since this display began, and was beginning to become lightheaded. She tried to empty her lungs of the stale air and take a draught of fresh, but her body would not obey this simple instruction. Somewhere in her innards a tick of panic began. The hocus-pocus had stopped now, leaving one part of her admiring quite dispassionately the tinkling music that was coming from the wall, the other part fighting the fear that rose in her throat, step by step. Again, she tried to take a breath, but it was as if her body had died, and she was staring out at it, unable now to breathe or blink or swallow. The spectacle of the unfolding wall had now ceased entirely, and she saw something flicker across the brick, ragged enough to be shadow but too substantial. It was human, she saw, or had been, but the body had been ripped apart and sewn together again, with most of its pieces either missing or twisted and blackened as if in a furnace. There was an arm, gleaming at her, and the ladder of a spine, the vertebrae stripped of muscle. A few unrecognisable fragments of anatomy. That was it. That such a thing might live beggared reason. What little flesh it owned was hopelessly corrupted. Yet live it did. Its eye, despite the rot it was rooted in, scanned her every inch up and down. She felt no fear in its presence. This thing was weaker than her by far. It moved a little in its cell, looking for some modicum of comfort, but there was none to be had. Not for a creature that wore its frayed nerves on its bleeding sleeve. Every place it may lay its body brought pain. This she knew indisputably. She pitied it. And with pity came release. Her body expelled dead air, sucked in living. Her oxygen-starved brain reeled. Even as she did so, it spoke. A hole opening up in the flayed ball of the monster's head, and issued a single, weightless word that was, "Julia."
It's me.
Kirsty put down her glass and tried to stand up. "Where are you going?" Neville asked. "Where do you think?" she replied, consciously trying to prevent the words from slurring. "Do you need any help?" Rory inquired. The alcohol made his lids lazy, and his grin lazier still. "I am house-trained," she replied. The riposte greeted with laughter all around. She was pleased with herself. Off-the-cuff wit was not her forte. She stumbled to the door. "It's the last room on the right, at the end of the landing," Rory informed her. "I know," she said, and stepped on into the hall. She didn't usually enjoy the sensation of drunkenness, but tonight she was revelling in it. She felt loose-limbed and light-hearted, and she might well regret this tomorrow, but tomorrow would have to take care of itself, for tonight she was flying. She found her way to the bathroom and relieved her aching bladder, then splashed some water onto her face. That done, she began her return journey. She had taken 3 steps onto the landing when she realised that somebody had put out the landing light while she was in the bathroom, and that somebody was now standing in a few yards away from her. She stopped. "Hello?" she said. But the cat breeder followed her upstairs in the hope of proving he wasn't Spade. "Is that you?" she asked, only dimly aware that this was a singularly fruitless line of inquiry. There was no reply, and she became a little uneasy. "Come on," she said, attempting a jocular manner that she had hoped masked her anxiety. "Who is it?" "Me," said Julia. Her voice was odd, throaty, perhaps tearful. Are you all right?" Kirsty asked. She wished she could see Julia's face. "Yes," came the reply. "Why wouldn't I be?" Within the space of those 5 words, the actress in Julia seized control. The voice cleared, the tone lightened. "I'm just tired," she went on. "It sounds like you're having a good time down there. Are we keeping you awake?" "Goodness me, no," the voice gushed. "I was just going to the bathroom." Pause, then, "You go back down. Enjoy yourself." At this cue, Kirsty moved toward her along the landing. At the last possible moment, Julia stepped out of the way, avoiding even the slightest physical contact. "Sleep well," Kirsty said at the top of the stairs. But there was no reply forthcoming from the shadow on the landing. Julia didn't sleep well, not that night nor any night that followed. What she'd seen in the damp room, what she'd heard and finally felt was enough to keep easy slumbers at bay forever, or so she began to believe. He was here, brother Frank was here, in the house, and had been all the time, locked away from the world in which she lived and breathed, but close enough to make the frail, pitiful contact he had. The whys and the wherefores of this she had no clue to. The human detritus in the wall had neither the strength nor the time to articulate its condition. All it said, before the wall began to close on it again, and its wreckage was once more eclipsed by brick and plaster, was Julia. Then simply, it's Frank, and at the very clear end the word, blood. Then it was gone completely, and her legs had given way beneath her. She'd half fallen, half staggered backward against the opposite wall. By the time she gathered her wits about her once more, there was no mysterious light, no wasted figure cocooned in a brick. Reality's whole was absolute once again. Not quite absolute, perhaps. Frank was still here in the damp room. Of that she had no doubt. Out of sight he might be, but not out of mind. He was trapped, somehow, between the sphere she occupied and some other place, a place of bells and troubled darkness. Had he died? Was that it? Perished in the empty room the previous summer, and now awaiting exorcism? If so, what had happened to his earthly remains? Any further exchange with Frank himself, or the remnants thereof, would provide an explanation. Of the means by which she could lend the lost soul strength she had little doubt. He had given her the solution plainly. Blood, he'd said. The syllable had been spoken not as an accusation, but as an imperative. Rory had bled on the floor of the damp room. The splashes had subsequently disappeared. Somehow, Frank's ghost, if that it was, had fed upon his brother's spillage and gained thereby nourishment enough to reach out from his cell and make faltering contact. What more might be achieved if the supply were larger? She thought of Frank's embraces, of his roughness, his hardness, of the insistence he had brought to bear upon her. What would she not give to have such insistence again? Perhaps it was possible, and if it were, if she could give him the sustenance he needed, would he not be grateful? Would he not be her pet, docile or brutal at her least whim? The thought took sleep away, took sanity and sorrow with it. She had been in love all this time, she realized, and mourning for him. If it took blood to restore him to her, then blood she would supply, and not think twice of the consequences. In the days that followed, she found her smile again. Rory took the change of mood as a sign that she was happy in the new house. Her good humour ignited the same in him. He took to the redecoration with renewed gusto. And soon, he said, he would get to work on the second floor. They would locate the source of dampness in the large room and turn it into a bedroom fit for his princess. She kissed his cheek when he spoke of this, and she said that she was in no hurry, and the room they had already was more than adequate. Talk of the bedroom made him stroke her neck, pull her close, and whisper infantile obscenities in her ear. She did not refuse him, but went upstairs meekly, and let him undress her as he liked to do, unbuttoning her with paint-stained fingers. She pretended the ceremony aroused her, though this was far from the truth. The only thing that sparked the least appetite in her, as she lay on the creaking bed with his bulk between her legs, was closing her eyes and picturing Frank as he had been. More than once his name rose to her lips, each time she bit it back. Finally she opened her eyes to remind herself of the boorish truth. Rory was decorating her face with his kisses. Her cheeks crawled at his touch. She would not be able to endure this too often, she realized. It was too much of an effort to play the acquiescent wife. Her heart would burst. Thus, lying beneath him, while September's breath brushed her face from the open window, she began to plot the getting of blood. Sometimes it seemed that eons came and went while he lingered. Eons that some clue would later reveal had been past bounds or even months. But now things had changed. He had a chance of escape. His spirit soared with thought. It was a frail chance. He didn't deceive himself about that. There were several reasons his best efforts might falter. Julia, for one. He remembered her as a trite, preening woman whose upbringing had curbed her capacity for passion. He had untamed her, of course, once. He remembered the day, among the thousands of times he had performed that act, with some satisfaction. She had resisted no more than was needful for her vanity, and succumbed with such naked fervour he had almost lost control of himself. In other circumstances, he might have snatched her from under her would-be husband's nose, but fraternal politics counselled otherwise. In a week or two he would have tired of her, and been left not only with a woman whose body was already an eyesore to him, but also a vengeful brother on his heels. It hadn't been worth the hassle. Besides, there had been new worlds to conquer. He had left the day after to go east, to Hong Kong and Sri Lanka, to wealth and adventure. He had them, too, at least for a while, but everything slipped through his fingers sooner or later, and with time he began to wonder whether it was circumstance that denied him a good hold on his earnings, or whether he simply didn't care enough to keep what he had. The train of thought, once begun, was a runaway. Everywhere, in the wreckage around him, he found evidence to support the same bitter thesis, that he had encountered nothing in his life, no person, no state of mind or body he wanted sufficiently to suffer even passing discomfort for. A downward spiral began. He spent 3 months in a wash of depression and self-pity that bordered on suicidal. But even that solution was denied him by his newfound nihilism. If nothing was worth living for, it followed, didn't it, that there was nothing worth dying for either. He stumbled from one such sterility to the next, until all thoughts were rotted away by whatever opiate his immoralities could earn him. How had he first heard of the Martian's box? He couldn't remember. In a bar, maybe, or a gutter, from the lips of a fellow derelict. At the time, it was merely a rumour. This dream of a pleasure dome, where those who had exhausted the trivial delights of the human condition might discover a fresh definition of joy. And the route to this paradise? There were several, he was told. Charts of the interface between the real and the realist, made by travellers whose bones had long since gone to dust. One such chart was in the vaults of the Vatican, hidden in code in a theological work unread since the Reformation. Another, in the form of an origami exercise, was reported to have been in the possession of the Marquis de Sade, who used it while imprisoned in the Bastille to barter with a guard for paper on which to write the 120 Days of Sodom. Yet another was made by a craftsman, a maker of singing birds called Le Marchand, in the form of a musical box, of such elaborate design a man might toy with it half a lifetime and never get inside. Stories, yet since he had come to believe in nothing at all, it was not so difficult to put the tyranny of veritable truth out of his head. And it passed the time, musing drunkenly on such fantasies. It was in Dursendorf, where he'd gone smuggling heroin, that he again encountered the story of the Martian's box. His curiosity was piqued once more, but this time he followed the story up until he found its source. The man's name was Kircher, though he probably laid claim to half a dozen others. Yes, the German could confirm the existence of the box, and yes, he could see his way to letting Frank have it. The price? Small favours here and there, nothing exceptional. Frank did the favours, washed his hands, and claimed his payment. There had been instructions from Kircher on how best to break the seal on Le Marchand's device. Instructions that were part pragmatic, part metaphysical. To solve the puzzle is to travel, he'd said, or something like that. The box, it seemed, was not just a map of the road, but the road itself. This new addiction quickly cured him of dope and drink. Perhaps there were other ways to bend the world to suit the shape of his dreams. He came back to the house on Ludovico Street, to the empty house behind whose walls he was now imprisoned, and prepared himself just as Kircher detailed for the challenge of solving the Martian's configuration. He had never in his life been so abstemious, nor so single-minded. In the days before the onslaught on the box, he led a life that would have shamed his sect, focusing all his energies on the ceremonies ahead. He had been arrogant in his dealing with the Order of the Gash. He saw that now. But there were everywhere, in the world and out of it, forces that encouraged such arrogance, because they traded on it. That in itself would not have undone him. No, his real error had been a naive belief that his definition of pleasure significantly overlapped with that of the Cenobites. As it was, they had brought incalculable suffering. They had overdosed him on sensuality until his mind teetered on madness. Then, they'd initiated him into experiences that his nerves still convulsed to recall. They'd called it pleasure, and perhaps they'd meant it, perhaps not. It was impossible to know with these minds. They were so hopelessly, flawlessly ambiguous. They recognized no principles of reward and punishment by which he could hope to win some respite from their tortures, nor were they touched by any appeal for mercy. He tried that. Over the weeks and months that separated the solving of the box from today, there was no compassion to be had on this side of the schism. There was only the weeping and the laughter, tears of joy sometimes, for an hour, without dread, a breath's length even. Laughter coming just as paradoxically in the face of some new horror fashioned by the engineer for the provision of grief. There was a further sophistication to the torture, devised by a mind that understood exquisitely the nature of suffering. The prisoners were allowed to see into the world they had once occupied, their resting places when they were not enduring pleasure, looked out onto the very locations where they had once worked the configuration that had brought them here. In Frank's case, onto the upper room of number 55 Ludovico Street. For the best part of a year, it had been an unilluminating view. Nobody ever stepped into the house, and then they'd come Rory and the lovely Julia, and hope had begun again. There were ways to escape. He'd heard it whispered. Loopholes in the system that might allow a mind supple or cunning enough to egress into the room from which it had come. If a prisoner were able to make such an escape, there was no way that the Hierophants would follow. They had to be summoned across the schism. Without such an invitation, they were left like dogs on a doorstep, scratching and scratching, but unable to get in. Escape, therefore, if it could be achieved, brought with it a decree absolute, total dissolution of the mistaken marriage which the prisoner made. It was a risk worth taking. Indeed, it was no risk at all. What punishment could be meted out worse than the thought of pain without hope of release? He had been lucky. Some prisoners had departed from the world without leaving sufficient sign of themselves, from which, given an adequate collision of circumstances, their bodies might be remade. He had. Almost his last act, bar the shouting, had been to empty his testicles onto the floor. Sweet, butter-fingered Rory had let his chisel slip. There was something of Frank to profit from the pain. He had found a fingerhold for himself, and a glimpse of strength with which he might haul himself to safety. Now it was up to Julia. Sometimes, suffering in the wall, he thought she would desert him out of fear. Either that, or she'd rationalise the vision she'd seen and decide she'd been dreaming. If so, he was lost. He lacked the energy to repeat the appearance. But there were signs that gave him cause for hope. The fact that she returned to the room on 2 or 3 occasions, for instance, and simply stood in the gloom, watched the wall. She'd even muttered a few words on the second visit, though he caught only scraps of the word "here" was among them, and "waiting" and "soon," enough to keep him from despair. He had another prop to his optimism. She was lost, wasn't she? He'd seen that in her face when before the day Rory had chiselled himself, she and his brother had had occasion to be in the room together. He'd read the looks between the lines, the moments when her guard had slipped, and the sadness and frustration she felt were apparent. Yes, she was lost, married to a man she felt no love for and unable to see a way out. Well, here he was. They could save each other, the way the poets promised lovers should. He was mystery, he was darkness, he was all she had dreamed of. And if she could only free him, he would service her. Oh yes, until her pleasure reached that threshold that, like all thresholds, was a place where the strong grew stronger and the weak perished. Pleasure was pain there, and vice versa, and he knew it well enough to call it home. It turned cold in the 3rd week of September. An arctic chill brought on a rapacious wind that stripped the trees and leaves in a handful of days. The cold necessitated a change of costume and a change of plan. Instead of walking, Julia took the car, drove down to the city centre in the early afternoon and found a bar in which the lunchtime trade was brisk but not clamorous. Customers came and went, young Turks from firms of lawyers and accountants, debating their ambitious parties of wine in grinders, whose only claim to sobriety was their suits. And more interestingly, a smattering of individuals who sat alone at their tables and simply drank. She garnered a good crop of admiring glances, but they were mostly from the young Turks. It wasn't until she'd been in the place an hour, and the wage slaves were returning to their treadmills, that she caught sight of somebody watching her reflection in the bar mirror. For the next 10 minutes, his eyes were glued to her. She went on drinking, trying to conceal any sign of agitation, and then, without warning, stood up across the table. Drinking alone, he said. She wanted to run. Her heart was pounding so furiously she was certain he must hear it. But no. He asked her if she wanted another drink. She said she did, clearly pleased not to have been rebuffed. He went to the bar, ordered doubles, and returned to her side. He was ruddy-featured and one size larger than his dark blue suit. Only his eyes betrayed any sign of nervousness, resting on her for moments only, then darting away like a startled fish. There would be no serious conversation. That she had already decided. She didn't want to know much about him, his name, if necessary, his profession and marital status, if he insisted. Beyond that, let him be just a body. And as it was, there was no danger of a confession. She'd met more talkative paving stones. He smiled occasionally, a short, nervous smile that showed teeth too even to be real, and offered more drinks. She said no, wanting the chase over with as soon as possible, and instead asked if he had time for a coffee. He said he had. The house is only a few minutes from here, she replied, and they went to her car. She kept wondering, as she drove the meat on the seat beside her, why this was so very easy. Was it that the man was plainly a victim, with his ineffectual eyes and his artificial teeth born? Did he but know it to make this journey? Yes, that was it. She was not afraid, because all of this was so perfectly predictable. As she turned the key in the front door and stepped into the house, she thought she heard a noise in the kitchen. Had Rory returned home, ill perhaps? She called out. There was no reply. The house was empty. Almost. From the threshold on, she had the thing planned meticulously. She closed the door. The man in the blue suit stared at his manicured hands and waited for his cue. I get lonely sometimes, she told him, as she brushed past him. It was a line she'd come up with in bed the previous night. He only nodded by way of response, the expression on his face a mingling of fear and meekness. Clearly, he couldn't quite believe his luck. Do you want another drink, she asked him, or shall we go straight upstairs? He only nodded again. Which? I think maybe I've drunk enough already. Upstairs, then. He made an indecisive move in her direction, as though he might have intended a kiss. She wanted no courtship, however. Skirting his touch, she crossed to the bottom of the stairs. I'll lead, she said, meekly. He followed. At the top of the steps, she glanced round at him and caught him dabbing sweat from his chin with his handkerchief. She waited until he caught up with her, and then led him halfway along the landing to the damp room. The door had been left ajar. Come on in, she said. He obeyed, and once inside, it took him a few moments to become accustomed to the gloom, and a further time to give voice to his observation. There was no bed. She closed the door and switched on the light. She had hung one of Rory's old jackets on the back of the door. In his pocket she left the knife. He said again, no bed. What's wrong with the floor? She replied. The floor? Take off your jacket. You're warm. I am. He agreed, but did nothing. So she moved across to him and began to slip the knot off his tie. He was trembling. Poor lamb. Poor, bleatless lamb. While she removed the tie, he began to shrug off his jacket. Was Frank watching this? She wondered. Her eyes strayed momentarily to the wall. Yes, she thought, he's there, he sees, he knows. He licks his lips and grows impatient. The lamb spoke. Why don't you, he began, why don't you maybe do the same? Would you like to see me naked? She teased. The words made his eyes gleam. Yes, he said thickly, yes, I'd like that. Very much. Very much. Very much. He was unbuttoning his shirt. Maybe you will, she said. He gave her that dwarf smile again. Is it a game? He ventured. If you want it to be, she said, and helped him out of his shirt. His body was pale and waxy, like fungus. His upper chest was heavy, his belly too. She put her hands to his face. He kissed her fingertips. You're beautiful, he said, spitting the words out as though they'd been vexing him out. Am I? You know you are. Lovely, loveliest woman I ever set eyes on. That's gallant of you, she said, and turned back to the door. Behind her, she heard his belt buckle clink, the sound of cloth slipping over skin as he dropped his trousers. So far and no farther, she thought. She had no wish to see him bathe naked. It was enough to have him like this. She reached into the jacket pocket. Dear, the lamb suddenly said. She let the knife lie. What is it? She asked, turning back to look at him. If the ring on his finger hadn't already given his status away, she would have known him to be a married man by the underpants he wore, baggy and overwashed, an unflattering garment bought by a wife who had long since ceased to think of her husband in sexual terms. I think I need to empty my bladder, he said. Too many whiskies. She shrugged a small shrug and turned back to the door. Won't be a moment, he said at her back. But her hand was in the jacket pocket before the words came out, and he stepped towards the door. She turned on him, slaughtering knife in hand. His pace was too quick to see the blade until the very last moment. And even then, there was bemusement across his face, not fear. It was a short-lived look. The knife was in him a moment after, slicing his belly with the ease of the blade and overripe cheese. She opened one cut and then another. As the blood started, she was certain the room flickered, the bricks and mortar trembling to see the spurts that flew from him. She had a breath's length to admire the phenomenon. No more, before the lamb let out a wheezing curse. Instead of moving out of the knife's range she had anticipated, took a step towards her and knocked the weapon from her hand. It spun across the floorboards and collided with the skirting. Then he was upon her. He put his hands into her hair and took a fistful. It seemed his intention was not violence, but escape. He relinquished his hold as soon as he pulled away from the door. She fell against the wall, looking up to see him wrestling with the door handle. His free hand clamped at his cuts. She was quick now, across to where the knife lay, up and back towards him in one fluid motion. He had got the door open by inches, but not far enough. She brought the knife down in the middle of his pock-marked back. He yelped and released the door handle. She was already drawing the knife out and plunging into him a second time, and now a third and a fourth. Indeed, she lost count of the wounds she made. Her attack lent venom by his refusal to lie down and die. He stumbled around the room, breathing and complaining, blood following blood onto his buttocks and legs. Finally, after an age of this farcical stuff, he keeled over and hit the floor. This time, she was certain her senses did not deceive her. The room, or the spirit in it, responded with soft sighs of anticipation. Somewhere, a bell was ringing. Almost as an afterthought, she registered that the lamb had stopped breathing. She crossed the blood-spangled floor to where he lay and said, "Enough." Then she went to wash her face. As she moved down the ladder, she heard the room groan. There was no other word for it. She stopped in her tracks, almost tempted to go back, but the blood was drying on her hands, and its thickness revolted her. In the bathroom, she stripped off her flower-patterned blouse and rinsed first her hands, then her speckled arms, and finally her neck. The dousing both chilled and braced her. Felt good. That done, she washed the knife, rinsed the sink, and returned along the landing, without bothering to dry herself or dress. She had no need for either. The room was like a furnace, as the dead man's energies pulsed from his body. They didn't get far. Already the blood on the floor was crawling away towards the wall where Frank was. The beads seemed to boil and evaporate as they came within range of the skirting boards. She watched, entranced. But there was more. Something was happening to the corpse. It was being drained of every nutritious element, the body convulsing as its innards were sucked out, gases moaning in its bowels and throat. The skin desiccating in front of her startled eyes, and at one point the plastic teeth dropped back into the gullet, the gums withered around them. And in mere moments it was done. Anything the body might have usefully offered by way of nourishment had been taken. The husk that remained would not have sustained a family of fleas. She was impressed. Suddenly, the bulb began to flicker. She looked to the wall, expecting it to tremble and spit her lover from hiding, but no. The bulb went out. There was only the dim light that crept through the age-beaten blind. "Where are you?" she said. The walls remained mute. "Where are you?" Still nothing. The room was cooling. Her breast had grown goose-flesh. She peered down at the luminous watch on the land's short arm. It ticked away, indifferent to the apocalypse that had overtaken its owner. It read 4:41. Rory would be back any time after 5:15, depending on how dense the traffic was. She had work to do before then. Bundling up the blue suit and the rest of his clothes, she put them in several plastic bags, and then went in search of a large bag for the remains. She had expected Frank to be here to help her with this labour, but as he hadn't shown, she had no choice but to do it herself. When she came back to the room, the deterioration of the lamb was still continuing, though now much slowed. Perhaps Frank was still finding nutrients to squeeze from the corpse, but she doubted it. More likely, the pauperized body, sucked clean of marrow and every vital fluid, was no longer strong enough to support itself. When she had parcelled it up in a bag, it was the weight of a small child. No more. Sealing the bag up, she was about to take it down to the car when she heard the front door open. The sound undampened